Hey folks, gather around because what I'm about to share with you sounds like something straight out of a horror movie. Only this ain't fiction. This happened to me, and if you stick around till the end, you might just rethink being alone in the dark. You see, I used to work security at this old hospital on the outskirts of town. Not one of those shiny modern places, but the kind that had been around long enough to see its fair share of misery and death. Places like this, they're not just buildings. They're holders of secrets, whispers of the past that sometimes refuse to stay silent. My job was simple, or so it seemed. Walk the halls at night, make sure all the doors were locked, and basically ensure that no one was up to no good in a place that was supposed to be about healing. But you see, when you're the only one roaming an old sprawling hospital in the dead of night, the line between the real and the imagined starts to blur. Shadows seem to move just beyond the corner of your eye, and every creak and groan of the old structure sounds like a whispered secret, desperate to be heard. The hospital was an imposing structure, a relic from an era when architecture was as much about grandeur and imposing a sense of awe as it was about functionality. Its long, dimly lit corridors stretched out like tentacles, each one lined with rooms that had seen more of life and death than any one person could imagine. Some parts of the hospital were still in use, but there were whole wings that had been abandoned, left to gather dust, and if you believe the rumors, ghosts. I had always been a practical person, not given to flights of fancy or superstitions. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But working the night shift in a place like that, it's hard not to start feeling the weight of all those years, all those lives that had passed through those halls. It's an eerie feeling, being the only living soul in a sea of memories, some of which, perhaps, were a little too restless. My nightly rounds were routine, almost mechanical. I'd start at the ground floor, methodically checking each room, each door, making sure everything was as it should be. Then, I'd take the elevator up, repeating the process on each floor, moving through the silent, empty spaces with only my flashlight and my own steady breathing for company. I knew every inch of the hospital, or so I thought. I knew where the floorboards creaked the loudest, which doors were prone to jamming, where the light from the street outside cast ghostly shadows through the windows. But familiarity breeds complacency. You start to see what you expect to see, hear what you expect to hear. That's why, when something truly out of the ordinary happens, it hits you all the harder. It shatters that illusion of control, reminds you that for all our modern arrogance, there are things out there that defy explanation, things that can make your blood run cold with fear. That night, the night that changed everything, started like any other. The hospital was as quiet as the grave, the only sounds the distant hum of the city and the occasional unexplained creaks and groans of the old building settling. I had just checked the emergency exits on the second floor, making my way to the elevator to begin my rounds on the third, when I heard it. A sound so faint, I thought I'd imagined it. A soft, almost imperceptible whimper like a child crying. At first I thought I was hearing things. The silence of the night can play tricks on you after all. But there it was again, a plaintive, sorrowful sound that tugged at something deep inside me. My first thought was, great, some teenagers broke in for a dare or something. It wouldn't have been the first time, and dealing with intruders was part of the job. But something about this felt different, more urgent. So I followed the sound, my heart beginning to race, not knowing that I was about to stumble upon a mystery that would haunt me to this very day. A mystery that began in room 315. I made my way towards the source of the sound, the soft crying that had disturbed the oppressive silence of the hospital's abandoned wing. My steps felt heavier as I moved, my usual confidence in the familiarity of these halls replaced by a creeping unease. The crying seemed to ebb and flow, at times barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I've faced down my fair share of intruders and vandals in my time on the job, but this was different. There's something about the sound of a child crying in the dead of night that cuts right through you, no matter how tough you think you are. The corridors of the third floor were less traveled, both by the living and, if you believed the stories, the dead. The paint was peeling, the air had a musty, forgotten smell, and the only light came from the weak, flickering bulbs overhead. It's funny, I'd walked these halls countless times, but right then, I might as well have been stepping into another world. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, and the silence hung heavy like a shroud. My rational mind was telling me to turn back, to write it off as a trick of the acoustics or a figment of my overworked imagination. But something pulled me forward. A sense of duty, maybe, or just plain old curiosity. The crying led me to room 315. I remember pausing at the door, hand on the cold metal of the handle, heart thumping in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, which struck me as odd since I had made sure all doors were securely locked, not more than 20 minutes earlier. It's those little details that stick with you, the ones that don't fit the pattern, that hint at something more going on beneath the surface. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, half expecting to find a group of kids huddled together, or maybe a stray animal that had somehow found its way inside. But the room was empty, or at least it appeared to be. No kids, no animals, not even the slightest sign of life. Just an empty bed, a couple of old rusting pieces of medical equipment, and the faint stale odor of antiseptic that seemed to linger in all these old rooms. For a moment I stood there, feeling a fool for letting my imagination get the better of me. The crying had stopped now, replaced by a silence so complete, it felt oppressive, almost suffocating. I was about to turn back to chalk it up to a long night and too much caffeine, when I saw it. A slight movement, just at the edge of my vision. I turned, expecting. I don't know what I was expecting, but it certainly wasn't what I saw. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, stood in the doorway. She was wearing a faded hospital gown that seemed to hang off her small frame, and her hair was in disarray, as if she had been tossing and turning in bed. But it was her eyes that caught me, held me in place. They were filled with such profound sadness, such a sense of loss and longing, that for a moment, I forgot to breathe. "Can you help me?" Her voice was so soft, so filled with sorrow, it was like a physical blow. In all my years, in all my encounters with the various and sundry characters you meet working security, nothing had ever cut me quite like that. I'd always prided myself on being the kind of man who knew what to do in a crisis, who could keep his head when all around were losing theirs. But standing there, in that dimly lit room, facing a child who seemed more ghost than girl, I found myself at a loss. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. She didn't answer, just turned and started walking away, her movements slow, almost dreamlike. And what could I do but follow? My duty, my entire reason for being there, was to protect, to provide assistance where it was needed. And here was a child, alone and frightened, in a place no child should ever be. So I followed her, through corridors that felt increasingly unfamiliar, as if the hospital itself had changed around us. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and still, we walked. I called out to her, asking her to wait, to tell me her name, anything that might help me help her. But she remained silent, her figure always just ahead of me, leading me deeper into the heart of the hospital's forgotten wings. It was only when we reached the old pediatric wing, a place of tragedy and loss, even in the best of times, that she stopped. The wing had been closed down years ago, following a fire that had claimed the lives of several young patients. It was a part of the hospital's history that was spoken of in hushed tones, a dark reminder of the fragility of life and the indiscriminate nature of tragedy. The girl stopped in front of what used to be the playroom, a space that had once been filled with laughter and the innocent clamor of children at play. Now, it stood silent, a hollow shell haunted by memories of joy forever lost. She turned to face me, and in the dim light, I could see her more clearly. The sorrow in her eyes was palpable, a deep, aching sorrow that seemed to speak of unspeakable loss. "They never let us out," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight that no child's voice should ever have to bear. The words sent a chill down my spine, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. It was as if the temperature in the hallway had dropped several degrees in the span of a heartbeat. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. One moment she was there, a specter of sadness and loss, and the next she was gone, leaving me alone in the silent, oppressive darkness of the abandoned wing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Part of me wanted to run, to leave this place and never look back. But another part, a part driven by a deep-seated need to understand, to find answers to the questions that were now swirling through my mind, urged me to stay, to explore further. The playroom was as silent and empty as the rest of the wing, the remnants of toys and games covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for years. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, of things long forgotten. But it was the walls that drew my attention. They were covered in drawings, the kind of drawings you'd expect to find in a children's playroom, bright and colorful, full of the innocent joy of childhood. But there was a sadness to them, a sense of longing and loss that seemed to echo the sorrow in the little girl's eyes. As I stood there, trying to piece together the puzzle of the crying child and the abandoned pediatric wing, a sense of unease settled over me. It was as if the very walls were whispering secrets, secrets that were meant to be kept hidden in the shadows. Her words, "They never let us out," hung in the air between us, echoing off the walls of the desolate pediatric wing with a weight that felt nearly tangible. It was a confession, a plea, and a revelation all rolled into one, and it hit me with the force of a freight train. Standing there, in the dim light of the hallway, looking into the eyes of this spectral child who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, I felt a profound sense of helplessness. What could I possibly do for her? How could I help someone who seemed so irrevocably lost? The girl vanished as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving me alone in the silence of the abandoned wing. The chill in the air seemed to deepen, seeping into my bones and leaving me shivering. I took a moment to collect myself, to try to make sense of what had just happened. I had seen things in my time working security at the hospital, things that I couldn't always explain, but nothing like this. Nothing that had ever made me feel so utterly out of my depth. The pediatric wing was a place of shadows, of echoes of laughter and tears that had long since faded into silence. It was here, in this wing, that a fire had broken out years ago, claiming the lives of several young patients. It had been a tragedy that had shaken the hospital to its core, leaving a scar that had never fully healed. And now, standing in the aftermath of that tragedy, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fire had left behind. More than just physical scars. It had left behind ghosts, remnants of lives cut tragically short, clinging to the only home they had ever known. Driven by a need to understand, to uncover the truth behind the little girl's words, I began to explore the wing with a newfound purpose. The playroom, once a haven of joy and laughter, was now just an empty shell. Its walls bare and its floor covered in a thick layer of dust. It felt like a mausoleum, a monument to the lives that had been lost. And as I stood there, I couldn't help but feel that I was intruding on sacred ground. My exploration led me deeper into the wing, to rooms that had once been filled with the sounds of children playing, of parents comforting their sick children. Now, they were silent, left to decay in the dark. And yet, as I moved from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the air itself was charged with the presence of those who had once lived here, watching me from the shadows, whispering their stories to anyone who would listen. It was in one of these rooms that I found it, a small hand-drawn picture taped to the wall. The paper was yellowed with age, its edges curling, but the image on it was still clear. It was a drawing of the hospital, rendered in the clumsy, innocent lines of a child's hand. But there was something off about it, something that sent a shiver down my spine. The windows of the hospital were drawn as eyes, wide and staring, and the doors as mouths, open in silent screams. And standing in front of the hospital were several stick-figure children, holding hands in a line. At the end of the line, drawn slightly apart from the others, was a single figure, smaller than the rest, with a question mark where its face should have been. I stared at the drawing, a cold sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. It was as if the child who had drawn it had known, had somehow sensed the fate that awaited them. The drawing was a message, left behind as a testament to the lives that had been lost, to the souls that had been trapped within the walls of the hospital, unable to escape even in death. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The little girl, her plea for help, the sense of being watched. It all made sense now. The fire hadn't just claimed the lives of those children, it had trapped them, leaving them to wander the halls of the hospital, forever searching for a way out. I left the room. The image of the drawing burned into my memory. As I made my way back towards the active parts of the hospital, the weight of what I had discovered pressing down on me, I knew that I couldn't just walk away. I had to do something to find a way to help those lost souls find peace. But what? I was just a security guard, a man with no power to change the past or to right the wrongs that had been done. But perhaps, I thought, there was someone who could. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light through the windows and chasing away the shadows of the night, I made a decision. I would speak to the hospital administration, tell them what I had seen and heard. Maybe, just maybe, they would listen. Maybe they would be able to bring in someone who could help, someone who knew how to deal with restless spirits and haunted places. It was a long shot, I knew, but I had to try. I couldn't just leave those children to wander the halls forever, lost and alone. I owed it to them, to the little girl who had reached out to me, to do everything in my power to help them find peace. So, as I clocked out at the end of my shift, the first rays of sunlight warming my face and offering a glimmer of hope, I made my way to the administration office, my heart heavy, but my resolve firm. I didn't know what would come of it, whether they would believe me or dismiss me as a crackpot. But I had to try. For the children of room 315, and for all the souls who had been left behind in the shadows of the old hospital. The journey from the ghostly silence of the pediatric wing to the administration office felt like moving between two different worlds. The early morning light filtering through the hospital windows did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep in my bones, a constant reminder of the night's eerie encounters. The hospital around me buzzed with the beginning of a new day, nurses bustling about, doctors discussing cases, the sounds of life that seemed so distant from the shadowy halls I had just left behind. Yet, the weight of what I had discovered in the pediatric wing bore heavily on me, a burden I knew I had to share, no matter how unbelievable it might sound. When I reached the administration office, the reality of what I was about to do suddenly hit me. How do you tell someone that their hospital is haunted by the spirits of children lost to a tragedy years ago? How do you explain that you've seen and spoken to one of these spirits, a little girl who simply asked for help? I braced myself for disbelief, for the skeptical looks and the rational explanations that would surely be offered. But the urgency of the message, the need to advocate for those who no longer had a voice, propelled me forward. I requested a meeting with the hospital director, a woman known for her pragmatic approach to management and her dedication to the hospital's legacy. To my surprise, she agreed to see me immediately, her curiosity piqued by the urgency of my request. As I sat across from her in her well-appointed office, the morning sun streaming in through the window, I took a deep breath and began my story. I told her everything, starting with the inexplicable crying that led me to room 315 and the apparition of the little girl in the faded hospital gown. I described the chilling words she whispered, "They never let us out," and the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the pediatric wing. I recounted the discovery of the child's drawing, a haunting representation of the hospital and the trapped souls of its young patients. Throughout, the director listened intently, her expression inscrutable, giving nothing away. When I finished, there was a long pause, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I expected skepticism, dismissal, perhaps even concern for my mental well-being. Instead, the director leaned forward, her eyes reflecting a depth of emotion I hadn't anticipated. "Thank you for coming to me with this," she said, her voice steady but soft. "You're not the first to sense something unsettled in that wing. We've had reports from staff and even some visitors over the years. Odd occurrences, feelings of being watched, unexplained sounds. We've always rationalized them away, but hearing your story, your encounter, it's hard to ignore." She paused, collecting her thoughts. The tragedy of the fire, the loss of those young lives. It's a dark chapter in our hospital's history, one we've tried to move past. But perhaps in doing so, we failed to acknowledge the depth of the trauma, the lingering pain that might still echo through these halls. The director stood up, walking to the window, looking out over the hospital grounds with a contemplative gaze. "I don't know what it means, or what we can do, but I promise you, we'll look into this. We owe it to those children, to their memories, to acknowledge their suffering and seek peace, not just for them, but for the hospital as a whole." Her words offered a glimmer of hope, a possibility that the children of room 315 in the pediatric wing might finally find the peace they were denied in life. It was a small step, perhaps, but a significant one. The hospital director's acknowledgement of the situation, her willingness to explore it further, felt like a validation of my experience, a confirmation that I hadn't imagined the whole encounter. As I left the director's office, the hospital around me no longer felt quite as oppressive, quite as heavy, with unspoken secrets. The day ahead was a busy one, filled with the routines and responsibilities of my job. But my thoughts remained with the little girl in room 315, her plea for help, and the promise of action that might finally bring her and the other lost children some semblance of peace. So folks, that's where my story ends for now. But the mystery of the crying child in room 315 and the secrets of the old pediatric wing remain, a haunting reminder of the past that still lingers in the shadows of the hospital. It's a story that has changed me, opened my eyes to the unseen, the unspoken, and the unresolved. And here's my call to action for you. If you ever find yourself brushing up against the unexplainable, the supernatural, or the simply unacknowledged, don't turn away. Listen, explore, and if you can, lend your voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. There are mysteries in this world, secrets hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough, or perhaps just curious enough, to uncover them. Who knows what you might find or who you might help by simply paying attention and daring to believe in the possibility of the extraordinary. Until next time, keep an open mind, and remember, the world is full of wonders, some of them cloaked in shadow, waiting just beyond the edge of our understanding. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and above all, stay tuned for whatever comes next, comes.